You are listening to the podcast of the Mathias Corvinus Collegium, the largest talent management institute in Hungary. If you want to know more about our mission, please look up our English website at mcc.hu/en or check out our Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter channels. For interesting articles and analysis of our professors, external contributors, and students, look up our knowledge base at corvinus.hu/en.
Dr. George Yancey, thank you very much for accepting our invitation to conversation on MCC podcast. Our guest today is a professor at Baylor University in Texas. His areas of expertise and research are the situation of Christianity in the contemporary United States, racial relations, and anti-Christian bias in academia and beyond. Dr. Yancey holds a PhD in sociology from the University of Texas at Austin, and he describes himself as a politically moderate Black Christian, and he has been described by others, if I'm correct, as probably the only academic researching anti-Christian bias at a secular university. So again, Dr. Yancey, thank you very much for accepting our invitation. You have written a number of highly acclaimed books on the situation of Christianity and faith in the US. One of these is One Faith No Longer, The Transformation of Christianity and Faith in Red and Blue America. And another two expressly addressing anti-Christian sentiment and bias are So Many Christians, So Few Lions. Is there Christianophobia in the US? And the second is Hostile Environment, Understanding and Responding to Anti-Christian Bias. So my first question is, we know that the percentage of people who describe themselves as Christians has declined remarkably sharply over the past 30 years. Do you think it's still fair to describe the United States as a majority Christian country?
Sure, and thanks for having me. Just one correction, now that I'm at Baylor, I'm not technically at a secular university, so I guess, that little description of me, argue whether or not we were ever a Christian country, but I would say that we used to be a country where Christianity was widely accepted as the dominant religion. And even if you weren't a Christian, there were certain Christian values and morals that were pretty evident in our society. And it shaped people's lives, even if they weren't Christians. I think that's no longer the case. I think that we are a post-Christian society at this point in time. Doesn't mean that Christianity has gone away or anything like that. And we still have a good percentage of people who are Christians, and that's gonna remain for quite a while, simply because what's really happened is that people who are nominally Christian tend to have now gone away. So what's remaining for the most part are people who have high religiosity, and because of high religiosity, they're going to remain Christians. You're probably talking about 30% of the country. 30, 35 maybe percent of the country, that's that way. But still, that's not a majority. So I think that that's likely what we're going to see in our society in the United States over the next few years. We'll see more of a falling away from nominal Christians and more of a core that retains their faith, but still to be a minority of the country.
I see. So based on your personal experience and your experience as a university professor, what manifestations do Christian students, Christian academics encounter in the modern day US?
Well, the way I think to really understand this is to understand who tends to not like Christians. And so one of my findings is that the people who tend to not like Christians tend to be wealthy, tend to be well-educated, white, male, highly progressive, irreligious. These tend to be people who control the culture. And by culture, what I mean is academia, I mean media, I'm talking about entertainment, the arts. These are the areas where people who don't like Christians tend to be. Well, what that means is, I don't know how the term translates over in Hungary, but what we call cancel culture, where people can culturally cancel you. That is something that a lot of Christians worry about. They're not worried like African Americans are worried about, maybe getting beaten up by the police, like that. That's not the concern Christians have. The concern they have is that culturally, people who are very powerful culturally will come down upon them and harass them in that way, get them fired, make it hard for them to get a job, stigmatize them. Those are the concerns Christians have in our society today. So it's different from other types of ways minority groups can be mistreated. I'm not saying we're a minority group at this point in time, but there is a mistreatment in certain dynamics in academia, for example, and in other ways. And I think that's part of it.
Thank you. Well, what my personal impression is that there's a lot of provocative activities going on at universities across the US that seem to be targeted specifically at Christians and at ridiculing Christians. Just to give a few examples from late last year, Dartmouth College, which is a prestigious institution in New Hampshire, staged a drag show late last year with a topless nun. And Harvard University, which was founded by Christians as a Christian university, staged a student production, a musical, in which Judas was portrayed as a gay man who was in love with Jesus. And the whole story was framed as a gay awakening of Jesus. And the University of Wyoming has started to accept transgender people, or biological males, into its sorority. So that's one side of the coin. But on the other side, we see that Christians feel limited in their free speech, or even limited in not only speaking their mind, but speaking the truth. So on the one hand, we have groups that are hostile to Christians, who ridicule Christianity. And on the other hand, we have Christians who are silenced and who are somehow afraid to speak out or afraid to stand up for their values and for their faith. What is your take on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think there's multiple takes. I think, part of what's happening is there's issues of sexuality and sexual minorities that people are dealing with. And I think rather than debating the viability of those issues, I did do some research where I showed that at least some of the support for sexual minorities is tied towards hostility towards Christians. That's not the most important factor, but it is a factor. And so I think sometimes people use these things. Sometimes people do it because they just believe in it. And what, people don't believe in it, that's one thing, but people just believe in it. But other times I think people do it because they want to, I think there's an element that wants to attack Christians, and this is a way of doing it. The cases that we have here in the United States about people going to bakers and ask them to bake a cake for a same-sex wedding, when they perfectly could go somewhere else and have someone bake them a cake, and they'd be happy to do that. Why are they going to a person who they know is a Christian, who they know does not want to bake that cake? I think that's part of, to me, that's more of an attack on Christianity rather than people having to do drag shows, which I do not appreciate, but it's sort of like live my attitude on that. So that's a problem. I think the bigger problem, and I do think that's a problem, I do think that people are trying to address these issues of sexual minorities in ways in order to provoke Christians. I do think that that's there, but it's not the only thing that's creating that. I'm more concerned, though, about direct attacks against Christians. For example, on a lot of college universities, they have what's called all-comers policies. These all-comers policies basically state that that if you have a Christian organization, that you cannot restrict your leadership to just Christians. So an atheist wants to head up InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, you cannot say you cannot head this up because you're an atheist. Well, you can imagine what that would do to a Christian group. You can imagine that would make a Christian group pretty soon not a Christian group. And these policies have been pushed on a lot of college campuses. So I find that very disturbing. That this is a way in which people can say to Christians, well, yeah, you can be a Christian organization, but you also have to allow these non-Christians to head your organization who don't obviously have your values. So there's that. I do think that the whole cancel culture thing, that a Christian does not feel very comfortable to set up and to speak their values, and with good reason, unfortunately. There are cases of Christians who, I know of a few, at least one or two cases where a Christian did not want to counsel same-sex romantic couples in their counseling program. And by the way, it is not uncommon for a counselor to say, look, I'm not comfortable with this, therefore I don't want to go on as a client. That's your choice. But for Christians, they somehow don't allow that choice. So there are problems that on these campuses, the cancel culture, the all-comers policies, and then my research on academic bias, where I document on how academics are willing to state about, depending on the discipline, anywhere from 30 to 50 or even 60% of academics will state that they're less willing to hire you if they find out that you are an evangelical or a Christian fundamentalist. And of course, those percentages for something like Jews is very low. Something like Muslims is pretty low. So when academics will say they're less willing to hire you because they find out you're a conservative Christian, then you have to ask the question, what sort of environment are we creating for Christians on college campuses?
Do they expressly state that you are less likely or even ineligible to be hired if you're a conservative Christian? Or is it done covertly, behind the scenes?
Well, in my survey, I actually use that as a question. I actually say, what if you find out this about this person? Are you less willing to hire you? And it varies. And some people would say slightly less likely, but they still are factoring in their religion, which you're not supposed to do on a state campus. And so yeah. Now, in the real world, would they? We have laws that would forbid them from stating that, but as an African American, I know that there's been audit studies that show that people are less willing to hire African Americans, even though they can't say that. So yeah, I think that is a very real problem. That when in some disciplines, I think 60% of the academics say to some degree they're less willing to hire you if they find out that you're a conservative Christian, then you understand why conservative Christians don't want to go into academia.
Speaking in terms of figures, we know that Christianity has declined from about 9 in 10 people being self-professed Christians in the early 90s to less than 2/3 across the general population being self-professed Christians today. How are those figures, in your opinion, at universities, let's say at top performing universities? How much of a Christian presence is there? And what about the general population, the same age group across the general population? How much does Christianity still have an appeal among young people in the US?
Yeah, I don't have precise numbers on that. I can look them up, with a little bit of time. So I don't have precise numbers. I do know that in each cohort, you're seeing a smaller percentage of people who are, well, actually, what you're doing is a higher percentage of people who are the nuns, and the nuns are the none of the above. And so, as I said, I think there's like about a 30% core of Christians that's probably not going to decrease. But what's happening as the cohorts go on, a higher and higher percentage of people who don't have faith and what I would think is probably going to happen, that probably, if not this current cohort, maybe the next one, you'll see about 30% of that cohort being Christian as compared to everyone else. Because I think we're going to get down to that core of people who strongly believe in the faith, and then they'll just sort of stop decreasing significantly from that point on. That's what I think we're heading towards. But yeah, the younger folks, they're less likely to adhere towards any sort of Christian faith than the older folks. That's clearly the case.
I see. How is this impacting American society in general? Because until relatively recently, in my memory, about 20 years ago, I recall thinking of America as a child in Central Europe as a profoundly Christian society compared to, let's say, countries in Western Europe. And now we're seeing that that's less and less the case. And there are instances of anti-Christian sentiment and even violence popping up everywhere, and it's reported globally. So I think people sense that this is a very significant development in terms of a sense of national unity. Now, you as an African American, a scholar, have done extensive research in race relations. How does the decline of Christianity, in your opinion, affect the ability of America to sort of stand as one united nation?
Yeah, the United States is just incredibly polarized right now. There's just no doubt about that. Unfortunately, a lot of times Christians don't lessen that polarization. We may even feed into that polarization. Those Christians who are on the left, they go with their group, and those on the right go with their group. So we as Christians can do more and should be doing more to lessen our polarization. Having said that, part of what plays in that polarization is, among other things, some of the anti-Christian attitudes that we have in our society. You are correct that 20 years ago, there was not the degree of anti-Christian. There's not the degree of antipathy towards Christians that we see today. I think it is increasing. And I think that it probably will increase for the foreseeable future, unfortunately. The notion of America as a Christian nation, I could see where people had that strong notion 20 years ago and less so today. You are correct that there is problems of anti-Christian persecution worldwide. And I've seen reports that Christians are the most persecuted group in the world, not in the United States, but in the world. And so I hadn't really thought about it, and it makes sense to me that an interesting question, which I guess you're bringing up, and this is kind of interesting, talking to someone who's not an American, which I don't do often enough. It may be that as our image as a Christian nation fades, that it may encourage more persecution of Christians around the world. I mean, I don't know if that's the case or not, but I hadn't thought about it quite that way before. But I can see how that might actually occur. So for that reason, it is, because if you think about it, if America is seen as a Christian nation, other countries may fear persecuting Christians because they don't want to anger America, because America is the military power of the world. But if America is no longer seen that way, then they may feel more emboldened to do that. I'm not sure that's the case, but I think that's something that if somehow we could study, it would be worth studying. Just think about it off the top of my head. But yeah, I mean, I think that that's something worth thinking about.
How would you compare anti-Christian sentiment or bias in academia as opposed to among the general public? Now, we know that the academic world in the US and elsewhere is very much tilted towards the left, and that non-Christian left-wingers are highly punch above their weight in academia, and Christians, conservatives, etc., are routinely underrepresented. But how does that work out in relation to the general population?
Okay, so just to sort of illustrate the point that you're making, and this is data that I got around 2007, 2008, so I'm pretty sure it's worse by now. But evangelical Protestants make up about 11% of all academics, even though in society they're about 30%. Atheists make up about 8% of all academics, but in society they're about 2 or 3%. Non-Christian religion makes up about 12% of academics and about 5% of the general population. So that distortion is there. Now, what's the implication of that? Well, one of the implications of that is when we did a survey on academics, I had them rank Christians, evangelical Christians. I'm trying to remember off the top of my head because I don't think I have the numbers here precisely. When we asked them to rank, say, evangelicals, and remember correctly, the ranking of evangelicals in the rest of society is like in the 60%, on a 0 to 100 scale, how much you like a group. I think it's like about 60%, 60 to 70, somewhere in that range. When we had academics do it, it's about 40. So that's about 10, 15, maybe 20% slide. That's pretty significant. On a scale of 0 to 100, that's pretty significant. I also asked academics questions about evangelicals, and so their attitude was kind of representative of a lot of what I found among anti-Christian individuals, what people have, say, Christianophobia. So those are some of the issues to consider. One thing to think about as far as Christianophobia here in the United States, and I do this just to illustrate it. I mean, I have all sorts of quotes I can give you that people gave me in their survey saying, their attitude towards Christians and how much they hate Christians and that sort of stuff. And some of it's quite nasty. But just to illustrate this, and before people say, well, that's just a few hard cases, you can buy a sticker, a bumper sticker or a shirt in the United States, or even a cup that says, so many Christians, so few lions. All right? So basically that's alluding to, why don't we feed Christians to the lions? You cannot buy a bumper sticker, a shirt, or a cup that says, so many Jews, so few Evans, because we know just how horrific of a statement that is. And yet you can buy this, saying this about Christians. Now, I'm not saying that that you just go to Target or that's a common store here in the United States or something like that and just get off the shelf. You have to go order it. But even the fact that it's available shows you how open some people are about their hatred for Christians. And remember that for some academics, and once if I was better prepared, I could give you some quotes. Some academics showed that level of hatred towards Christians as some of the people that we interviewed about Christianophobia. So it is a very serious problem that we have to consider, especially since academics are the ones who generate a lot of our cultural information, a lot of our research, a lot of the materials that we use. They determine when we do a study, that study often is then written about in an article and gets out there. And so when people are not studying anti-Christian bias, it means the public thinks it doesn't exist. People study Islamophobia, which does exist, and people know it exists. They study anti-Semitism, which does exist, and they know it exists. Academics are not studying Christianophobia. So a lot of people think it does not exist, that it's just made up. But of course, the evidence shows otherwise.
So how open, as a scholar of anti-Christian bias and Christianophobia, do you think the academic world is to exploring this area or taking it into consideration? Because as you said, Christians are the most persecuted group, religious group right now across the world. And yet what we are seeing is that it's gaining very little coverage in the mainstream media.
Yeah. I think academics are willing to study anti-Christian bias around in a third world country, or something like that. I think they're willing to do that. I think they're willing to study it in Western Europe or in the United States for the most part. And I think the reason why, quite simply, is because they fit a lot of the parameters of Christianophobia. And so they don't want to study something that says, I might have a problem with religious bigotry. So they don't want to study that. But would they study it in, say, Iran or somewhere like that? They would, because then they can say, well, I'm not a Muslim. These are the problems the Muslims have. It's not a problem that I have. Now, I will say that I think that they study that less than they'll study Islamophobia in Europe. They'll study that less than they'll study, anti-Semitism. But I think they will study it outside of Western civilization. But they do not want to study it. And there's a few exceptions, but they do not want to study it by and large in Western civilization.
Oh. We do know that America right now is extremely divided geographically between red and blue states, urban areas, rural areas, etc. Is this anti-Christian bias typical of higher education across the country, or is it limited to urban centers, which are very much in favor of voting left?
Yeah, I think on the college campus, it really doesn't matter where you're at for the most part. So if you're on college campus, I'm going to say Texas. I don't know how much you all know about Texas, but we're considered one of the red states. Pretty red. I mean, we're going to vote for Republicans for the foreseeable future, for good, for bad. But if you go on campus, I think you'll find the same level of progressive ideology at the University of Texas at Austin than you will at University of California, Berkeley. Maybe not among the students, but among the faculty, definitely. And I think what this means is that to the degree that anti-Christian bias is a problem in academia, I don't think it matters where in the United States you're at as far as your college campus. Now, you go outside the college campus, then it does matter. But on college campuses, I don't think it really matters whether you're in a red or blue state.
So you're saying that it doesn't really matter whether I'm at an Ivy League university like Harvard or Princeton, or at, for example, a historically black college somewhere in the South. The level of anti-Christian bias among the faculty and to a certain extent even among the students is the same, or at least comparable.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I can look at my data. I did look at my data when I wrote Compromising Scholarship, and I didn't see much of a difference between the elite schools and the non-elite schools. I didn't see, I didn't look at regionally, but I think I did run some tests and I looked at region. I don't think the region really mattered. Black universities, historically black universities, that might matter. I don't have a question to look at that. So it might matter since in the African American community there is a strong Christian presence. But my guess would be that at a HBCU, among the faculty, not the students, among the faculty, that the sentiment against conservative Christians is probably just as strong as it is in other colleges. But I can't for sure say that, but my sentiment is that that's the case.
How much is anti-Christian sentiment intertwined or linked to certain political standpoints or political positions? Like, let's say, obviously, to openly be hostile to Christians is on a religious basis is less acceptable than saying that you're not allowed or you're not welcome to be critical of abortion or transgenderism or transgender people in sororities or same-sex marriage. So how much is anti-Christian sentiment cloaked in standing up against certain political positions or canceling certain ideas?
Yeah, so when we say race, there's this concept known as symbolic racism, which means that, let's say you don't like Hispanic people, but you can't say that because then you're called a racist. So what you do is you don't like illegal immigration. You'll say that because that's a way of getting at Hispanic people and yet not being accused of being a racist. I think the same thing tends to happen among progressives on Christians. Like I said, I already have done some research that shows that that at least some of the support of sexual minorities is tied to anger towards Christians. Okay, so I already know statistically that some of it is tied to that way. So I do think that happens. Now I will say that sometimes, for example, we know that Bernie Sanders, our vice president now, Kamala Harris, trying to think, Cory Booker, and I believe Dianne Feinstein have all at different times, all these are senators in the United States Senate, or were in the United States Senate. Kamala Harris, of course, is vice president of the United States, have basically talked to either a judge nominee or a nominee for appointment in the government, and basically have said some version of, well, because of your beliefs on this, your theological beliefs on this, I don't want to vote for you. For example, I'm a little mixed up, so I forget who said what. I believe Harris stated to one candidate that because, and if I get the details wrong, I apologize. I can look up the details later on, but those names are true. That Harris said to a candidate something like, because you have talked about abortion being wrong in your religious writings, and you don't believe in abortion as a Catholic, then I don't want to support you. I believe Sanders talked to another person who wrote things believing that something along the lines that Muslims are not saved, which is a theological position. And he said, because that's your position, a theological position, I can't support you for this. Now, these are what we call religious tests. These are tests of having the right religious beliefs in order to have a job. That's supposed to be illegal in the United States, although a senator can vote for anyone or not for any reason they want to. So, but that's supposed to be illegal, and yet these people have openly said, your religion is not right, therefore I will not vote for you in this job. So sometimes it's overt. It's not always covert, and sometimes it is overt. But a lot of times I think that people hide their hostility behind claims of, well, I'm just standing for this issue, when I think it's probably because they don't like Christians, just like sometimes I think people hide their racism in that way.
My final question is, can you sense a backlash? Is there any backlash against anti-Christian bias? Are people actually recognizing that something has to be done against this? Or are they just silently going on and being swept with the tide as it gets more and more severe? Mm-hmm. Or at least this is what I recollect from your assessment.
Yeah, I don't think there's a backlash against anti-Christian bias at this point in time, in part because I don't think, like the media isn't going to show a show about it. The academics don't study it. So our culture has not concluded that this is a potential problem. There is a bias against some of the excesses of, say, the trans identity thing. I think some people have backlash against transitioning minors. We're seeing more of that. And so that may lead eventually so I say that just to say that if the issues get out there sufficiently, there could be a backlash. Because the issues are not out there sufficiently, because we're seeing that with some of the trans issues, some of the issues of competition, athletic competition, of transitioning kids or minors. I won't say kids, minors. So the issues got out there, there could be a backlash. So I think part of what has to happen is that somehow we have to find ways to get these issues out there, to illustrate them in creative ways. It'd be great to have more Christians who are actually, or non-Christians for that matter, because you can study anti-Semitism and not be a Jew, who would study this sort of hostility. I think that could produce a backlash against anti-Christian attitudes. But I fear that without that, be it in academia or the arts or media, without getting the issues out there, I don't think that we're going to see that sort of backlash at this point in time. So
your final point is that it's going to get worse before it gets better, if I understand correctly.
Unfortunately, that's probably what I conclude. Now, there are things we as Christians can do to mitigate it. I think we need to live out our faith. I think we need to be not of this world. I think we have to, some things I write on racial issues is things that we can approach it in a way that's useful rather than just anti-racism or colorblindness. So I think there are things we can do, but yeah, we don't control the culture. I think that because we don't control the culture, we are at the mercy to some degree of the culture as far as these sort of issues.
Dr. George Yancey, Professor of Sociology at Baylor University in Texas, thank you very much for your valuable and intriguing thoughts.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this MCC podcast episode. For further media content, please look up our English website at mcc.hu/en or look for us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you want to read more by our professors, external contributors, and students, check out our knowledge base at corvinus.hu/en.